David. So thank you for joining us here today. So fantastic. Great to have everyone here. I'm pleased to have David with us today for his presentation. So my name is Kevin Bowling and I'm with the Secular Student Alliance. Just a quick few housekeeping things. We are streaming this live on Facebook and Twitter. So if you're joining us there, we do have someone who is watching those channels. So if you have questions at the end of the presentation, please feel free to type those into the comments and we'll be sure to get those to David so that he can answer those. And for those of you who have joined us as well, of course, we want you to participate. So at the end, we'll be doing the little Q&A with David as well. So good. So just to start, we're very glad to have David here with us today. He's a full professor at SUNY Medgar Evers College, an anthropologist by early training, and you've written numerous things. I think you've been in multiple magazines, The Humanist. You're a little bit of everywhere, which is great. And you have a new book out, which is
Darwin's Apostles.
There you go. Because I have an old bio for you, and I was like, I know it's on there, and this is not it. So yes. And so David, of course, is going to be talking. There you go. And that was last year, correct?
Yeah, it was November of 2019 that it came out. And then the pandemic happened. And so it's 2021 now that we can actually start to share some of the information again, but it's been out all this time. Yeah.
Well, good. Well, fantastic. It's great to have you here with us today.
Thank you.
So without further ado, I'm going to let you take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Kevin. I really appreciate the invitation to come and speak at this year's SSA Darwin event. You know, when I was a young anthropology student, I had always been someone who was very curious, always a non-believer, certainly a secularist. And I only wish back in the Jurassic period when I was a college student that there was an SSA that I could have joined with like-minded people who are committed to secular democracy, understanding the natural world, seeing the world as it is rather than the way we want it to be. And I really appreciate all of your work, all of the students and everyone connected to SSA as well.
Thank you. That means a lot. And I know you've had some good involvement with the SSA in the past, and we appreciate all your work. And clearly having faculty at campuses really makes a difference for our students. And besides that, with your expertise as well. So we appreciate it also.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So I can, let me see now if I can share my screen. And voila. We have the PowerPoint ready. So I'll just start by noting a couple of things. Because I'm an anthropologist, I'm very holistic in my approach to many things. That as you know, you sort of see things from multiple levels, and you see that the world and the issues at hand are as long as they are deep. And so while we'll be focusing on Darwin as an apical freethought ancestor, we can't not talk about Darwin and his life and all of his connections without going into several issues related to not only his history, but the history of natural selection in general. And I'd like to start by, first, of course, oh, why can I not? I'm not sure why I can't move the PowerPoint. So there's a minor technical difficulty, it looks like. Hello?
I'm here.
Yeah, I'm not sure why here, let me try it from down here. Sorry. Yeah, there we go. Okay. My fault. Again, as I was mentioning, I'm a little bit of a Luddite. I'm sure half the people viewing this were probably screaming at their screens and saying, go to the left bottom corner. So I appreciate all your help. Before we start talking about Darwin, there's a lot of other things that are happening in February, which I think deserve an amount of attention. Certainly, this is Black History Month. On February 11th, it's also National Day of Women and Girls in Science. And so it's important, I think, that we remember that the patriarchy has had real problems with inclusion. And through this lack of inclusion, the stories and the people who have given so much to science don't get their fair share of acknowledgement. We could certainly go back in time and think about Hypatia and Madame Curie, and if you saw Hidden Figures, about Johnson and Vaughan and Jackson and their help with NASA. We can't also forget Jane Goodall and Maeve Leakey and Penny Patterson of the Gorilla Foundation. So many women, so many people of brown and Black skin or indigenous peoples who have made a commitment to the world of science. And while we're talking about Darwin, we have to really talk about everybody else. Because quite literally, there are millions of people who have worked in all facets of sciences, including helping with the creation of the new coronavirus vaccines that will essentially help move our common humanity forward. So I'm a big believer, not in religion, but in Mr. Rogers. And there's something that Mr. Rogers always does, which is he calls attention to remembering those who have made a difference in your life, and that you should take a few moments in your own time to remember them. So what I like to do is, for everyone who is on this presentation tonight, is to just take a moment. Maybe we take 15 or 20 seconds. I'll time it. And remember the girls, a girl or a woman, or girls and women, or people of different ethnic groups who, because of their work in science, they loved you into being. They might have been a mentor for you or something like that. So let's just take 20 seconds and say thank you to the world, which is not white Anglo-Saxon male. We'll do 20 seconds. Okay, so thank you. I hope this was satisfying. If you are female and you're watching this, if you're gendered in any way how you describe yourself, if you're Black, brown, indigenous, know that you are wanted in science, that science belongs to you as it belongs to everybody else. But now we'll go forward. So one of the things about Darwin's work is that it is profound and has impacted the world around us in hundreds, if not millions of different ways. In fact, in surveys that are done, when people say, what are the things that really make us human? It's the understanding of gravity, of DNA and RNA, the concept of zero in mathematics, Earth's place in the universe. And then there were these rather non-scientific surveys that are done. By the way, if you notice, evolution is usually one of the ones that is in the top few that are talked about as we know the world because of these things. And Time magazine did a study of the 100 people. And while this is more about likes and things like that, you'll notice that of the top 100 people who've made a difference in the world, Charles Darwin comes in based on their unscientific survey is number 12. Well, I unscientifically like to always take out the religious, the fascists, the slaveholders, and the conquerors. And when you take that out, you see Darwin actually moves up like a bullet to number 4. So the impact of Charles Darwin, whether we see it in lay terms or we see it as part of our understanding of science, is really, really very deep. In fact, 50 years after Origin of a Species was published, it was published in 1859, you had people like John Dewey coming out and talking about the importance of Darwin's work and how it impacted education, how it created an intellectual revolution. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about humanists and atheists and non-believers, but it changed the tenor of how we could talk about things because it gave us an avenue to look at deep time. And you find that also that it wasn't just people like Dewey, but W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote in 1909 in The Evolution of the Race Problem, that what Darwin also did, and Huxley certainly points this out earlier, 50 years earlier, is that Darwin, through Origin of Species, created a sense of equity. That is, if we're all from a common human ancestor, well, you know, what gives someone the right to take another group's land or destroy a culture or language for the sake of their country? That is, why are we not sharing the resources of this planet, both economically, politically, and socially, more evenly if we are all really brothers and sisters under the skin? So there's this acknowledgement just even 50 years after the work of Darwin, but even much earlier than that too. If you think about natural selection, it's not a modern theory. In fact, you can go back to the 7th century BCE, where we have people who, like Anaximander, who postulated that life rose from the sea. You have Aristotle and Plato talking about essentialism and the earliest idea of a great chain of being, that is, things are related to each other biologically. The Chinese philosopher Zhang Zhu looking and saying that species change over time in the 4th century BCE. Now, you know, we're talking about adaptation and speciation here way before people actually even had words for it. And then if you look at the Islamic philosopher Nasir al-Din Tusi, you find that the writings there are incredibly modern in the sense that the author wrote 700 years before Darwin and Wallace wrote their papers, coming up with the same idea of natural selection. If you fast forward, you find that leading up to Darwin's work, you have Comte de Buffon, you have Linnaeus, Lamarck, Cuvier, even Erasmus's grandfather, who wrote that the Earth was 70,000 years old. Buffon did that as well. Before that, you had a literal interpretation of the Bible, which said that it's only 6,000 years old. In fact, we still have that with us today. We haven't grown past that adolescence in thinking. And so you find that there's a precursor to the work of Darwin that these philosophers and practitioners of science, who were deeply religious, of course, for the most part, and really saw religion and science as being one central idea, really helped move the world forward, even though there was so much more to see and to know and to get to know. And what Darwin's seminal work did in The Origin of Species was really move us 150 years or 200 and 350 years into the future back in 1859. We also have to thank people like Alexander von Humboldt, who was an explorer in the generation before Darwin, who Darwin himself read of Humboldt's explorations. If you've ever heard of the Humboldt Current, that is this man. In fact, he was quite the humanist and intellectual who discarded religion for the natural world and was certainly foundational and supportive of Darwin's work. Von Humboldt died in 1859, the year of the publication of The Origin of Species. But he was an admirer of Darwin as Darwin was of his, and a supporter of Darwin as well. So here's some, if you ever want to go to if you want to search the internet or go to your local library, you can look up Humboldt and all that he did as a naturalist, which excited people in the 19th century to also go and explore and take things back to their laboratories and understand them, which was really Darwin's sole interest in being. You know, Darwin was a student who started out as great synthesis, and 20 years after his trip to the Galapagos, taking all of that research and all the research that came out of that with his connections and correspondence with other naturalists from literally around the globe, who would send species to Darwin, and then Darwin would use those for his own research. You know, Origin of Species is pretty simple. That's one of the wonderful things about it, which made it so special when it came out. It basically points to three different things. You know, populations vary. Offspring will look like their parents, but their differences are historic and are related to the environment and reproduction and survival. Very simple ideas. So really what Darwin was saying is that, look, things change over time. Traits that support survival are important for reproduction, will continue, and species will adapt or speciate or go extinct within their environment. Very, very simple, but earth-shattering in the sense that when it came out in 1859, the church and those who were connected to science and religion really fought this idea. And it's one of the reasons why Darwin took 20 years to publish. So one thing that we should note also is that Darwin never wrote about the idea of society as practiced under the same ideas of speciation, adaptation, and extinction. Darwin was anti-slavery, although not anti-patriarchy. Darwin had a dim view of women in science and women's intellectual robustness, not really seeing it on par with males. And it should be noted that sometimes great men get it wrong. You know, he was as much a person of his time as he was a person of our time. But Darwin's apostles were very sympathetic to the social forces. They were pro-labor. Things were changing very dramatically in the 19th century. And if you grew up in the 19th century, you would not see the world so terribly different. I don't think it would be as much a strange place where if you were 300 years ago or 500 years ago or 600 years ago, and vice versa, if we went back to that time, although we wouldn't have the comforts of the internet and Facebook and Twitter and iPhones, we could understand that time very, very well. So why was Darwin's ideas rejected? Well, for several reasons. Some of them were religious, but some of them were simply spiritual. Victorian England and Queen Victoria was a spiritualist, especially after her husband died. There were tons of seances and belief in the occult and the idea that you can read palms and read leaves. And so if you are connected to the world of magic as the occult is, there's a reluctance to accept the material universe as it is, especially if we think about things like death. And so Victorian England sort of rejected Darwin's work, not so much because there was so much religion involved, but because of the superstition and the occult that was involved. That doesn't mean there wasn't structural issues related to religion that fostered a suspicion of Darwin's work or outright hostility. You know, science and religion in even the great thinkers of the time, some of Darwin's own apostles, Asa Gray, who was an incredible naturalist, who was an American, sought to bring religion and evolution together. And while he accepted natural selection, you know, went to the idea of, well, first cause, which is we find today very much. The idea of, well, what started it all? So science and religion up until Darwin's time was still very, very connected. The Church of England and the Vatican really despised Darwin and his work and saw the writing on the wall. And as T.H. Huxley said, that one of the things Darwin did when he wrote Origin of Species, and this is a quote from Huxley, is that he killed God. Because if we are all here and part of nature and we're all connected, then there's no place for God in this scheme of the world that relies on material rationalism for the world to exist. And you found that the monarchy and social elites equally distrusted Darwin because, again, if you're saying we're all equals underneath the skin and all of this stuff on the outside is just, well, adaptation, then the reality is, well, what gives you the right for both God and country to say, that country is mine? And so the monarchy and social elites really were suspicious of Darwin. Of course, Darwin didn't help himself in these matters very much. He was a deep thinker. He was a brilliant naturalist, and he was an excellent writer. But he had severe issues related to shyness. He had real phobias, and they came out as psychosomatic illness. Darwin spent a lot of his time in bed after and even before The Origin of Species was published because he knew how disruptive the ideas that he was bringing forward were going to be. And so, you know, it even affected his home life. You know, his wife was a believer. And the thing that upset his wife was that if Darwin was going down this road with his ideas, that there would clearly be a break, and she believed that they would not see each other in the afterlife. So this played on Darwin as well. Certainly the loss of his daughter, Annie, when she was 9 years old, haunted him. And that was one of the real breaks with him in terms of theology. I think he, to the end of his days, never came out as an atheist, but certainly came out in one of his last interviews, and we'll touch on that, as an agnostic. And finally, again, he was not a public speaker. He was a researcher and a collaborator, but never spoke on his own behalf. Theodorus Dobzhansky said that this is a Polish biologist who said that biology would not make sense except for the light of evolution. And we know that to be true. Darwin knew it then, although Darwin, you have to remember, grew up at a time in the world where there were no scanning electron microscopes, right? So think about it. Here he is, and Wallace as well. We have to give our platitude, our thanks to Alfred Russel Wallace as well, because he, is the co-discoverer of natural selection in its most modern form. So just as Darwin wrote in his journals in the 1830s and 1840s, the seminal idea that species change over time, we see that in the Tree of Life. Again, this is Darwin writing, taking the idea of the great chain of being, removing the gods and the archangels, looking at things through the idea of adaptation and speciation and extinction, and really moving the idea that we are all part of nature. We see that in the Tree of Life. We see this with all the many phylums. We see this in the idea and the philosophies connecting Darwin to Draper and Wallace, to Neil deGrasse Tyson, to Carl Sagan, to hundreds of intellectuals across all fields of knowledge, whether it be the physical sciences, the social sciences. The root for many of them, they will say, certainly was Darwin's seminal work in both The Origin of Species and eventually later in The Descent of Man. And you see that come out in all of the disciplines that are affected by natural selection, not just anthropology, but even religious studies. We talked about Dewey earlier in education, but you will find writings in all of these areas that either rely on Darwin's work or have some connection to the idea of natural selection in how the operations of these disciplines work. So what did Darwin do? He liberated us from the inadequacies of a theologically centered view of the cosmos. He removed that from the need to have to believe in the divine. If you choose to believe in the divine, that's your choice. But Darwin rethought the world without a theological or divine center. And so that liberation is very important. He also simultaneously showed that if we are humanistic in our views, that patriarchy and imperialism are evils that are justified on race theory, which if you read Darwin's work, who is so anti-slavery, you realize that both the cure for human suffering and the solace does not have to come from anything other than the ethics of goodness that humanism can provide. So we have a tale of two June 30ths. Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859, November of 1859. In 1858, he and Alfred Russel Wallace co-authored what would become the opening salvo at the Linnean Society of the examples of natural selection. And it was then a year later that Origin of Species was published. And then a year later still was the, what I like to call which is known as the Huxley-Wilberforce debate, in which it was clear that not only Huxley, who argued for Darwin's behalf, but also um, uh, Joseph Hooker, who was one of Darwin's oldest friends and who was the chief botanist at the Royal Kew Gardens, and Draper also spoke in Darwin's defense, two of Darwin's apostles in the book. These were, of course, the people who really are focused on the book, Darwin's Apostle, and how they actually worked both as spokespeople for Darwin, writing individual op-eds in favor of Darwin, speaking out on Darwin's behalf because Darwin was incapable of doing so. So men like Joseph Hooker, T.H. Huxley, John William Draper, Asa Gray, Alfred Russel Wallace, had they not in 1859 and 1860 and then going forward really up for the next 30 years been advocates for Darwin's work, who knows what would have happened to Darwin's work? It could have been sidelined because there were so many people in the in both the scientific community and the aristocracy who would have loved to see Darwin's work die on the vine. These men and many others, men and women, saw that it didn't happen. But these five gentlemen were certainly advocates for Darwin's work. And at the time of Darwin's work in 1859, you have a lot of things that were happening. You have the suffrage movement in both the United States and in England. You have labor reforms, prison reforms, the idea of children getting education, getting educated, healthcare reform, all these things that we're still sort of tinkering with because we know they're not working to the best, had their own, if you'll pardon the word, genesis in terms of the modern world in the 1850s, in the 1860s, in the 1880s, along with the stupendous work of Charles Darwin, who really did help move these ideas forward, both as standalone, but also in support of these ideas. Even if Darwin didn't accept some of them themselves, they drew on Darwin's work. And so you have people like Marx, who really saw, who loved Darwin's work. He might not have accepted all the aspects of it, but he referred to Darwin as a great mind and a great thinker. In fact, Marx sent a copy of Das Kapital to Darwin, inscribing it with the words of, you're my good friend. Then you have other people who are definitely on the left, who are either communists or socialists, who also spoke out in writings after reading The Origin of Species, saying that basically evolution shows that nature levels the playing field. You have other people who were scientists and people who are on the left who wrote, including Peter Kropotkin later on, who wrote that Darwin's work really showed that there were greater implications for the world in terms of social theory, fairness, humanness, humanism. And so these are just some of the people who Darwin's whose lives were touched by Darwin, and they were great thinkers of themselves. The purpose of this talk is to really look at the growing 19th century movement of the free thought. And so now we finally get here after all this pre-stuff that went on, and we'll talk in more detail about some of the great thinkers, the free thinkers of the 19th century. People like Robert Ingersoll, who was known as the great agnostic, who really was the rock star, I always say that, of American free thought in the 19th century. Newspapers would follow this man from town to town. There were no blogs at the time, so they would put out these little penny or pence. Well, in America, it was probably like 2 cents rather than pence. Little pamphlets of his speeches. And, he was, Susan Jacoby wrote a wonderful book about him, calling him the great agnostic. And he clearly was, and he really fought for the ideas of humanism, the same things that Felix Adler was doing for the Ethical Society, Ingersoll was doing for humanism and a world without the need for theology. Some of the things that he said was that this century is Darwin's century, and that his work affected the globe, and that Darwin's work in one volume said more than any religious teacher. Another quote from Ingersoll was about the church and teaching ignorance, if you will. The idea of these fantasies of, life with talking snakes and all this other stuff, really not being anything more than mythology. And we owe Darwin our thanks, because when you replace mythology with facts, you get truth. And Darwin was a truth seeker. Again, this is Ingersoll writing in Ingersoll the Magnificent, which is a book about him, that Darwin basically destroyed the foundation of Orthodox Christianity. He took away the need to have fear and the need to have faith, and for us to be able to clearly investigate the natural world using our reason and the tools of science. Finally, here's another quote where Ingersoll relies on Spencer and Draper, who's one of the people who supported Darwin. Humboldt is mentioned, of course, and how the science, the world of science, can explain much more in moments than a doctrine in theology can present in decades of religious study. The next person is D.M. Bennett, who was a very important person. He was the first publisher of something called The Truth Seeker, which is still in publication today. It was an atheist humanist newspaper that came out and started in the mid 1800s. He would go on to serialize, that is, publish portions of the entire book of The Descent of Man in this work, in The Truth Seeker. It was in The Truth Seeker that when Darwin's body was moved from its first resting place after he died in 1882 to Westminster Abbey, that it was the Truth Seeker who said, hold on, guys, now you're embracing him, when in his life you treated him with disrespect. So you find that the Truth Seeker was very, very important to the early humanist free thinker movement, because it was the publication to go to. It was before the internet, and you needed to get this magazine if you wanted to fill out your mind. The Truth Seeker would also publish pro-Darwin articles and stuff about origin of species during the Scopes monkey trial. So here are some excerpts. Here's Aveling in his discussion with Darwin, who here in one of his last interviews said he would not really necessarily consider himself an atheist, but as an agnostic, but that at the end of his life, and actually earlier than the end of his life, would sort of give up on Christianity as a moral philosophy, a way of seeing and explaining the world, and the fear that comes with what happens after we die. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's of course known for the suffrage movement, relied on Darwin's work as well, and showed that if species are the same, then what gives man the right, that is man with a capital M, or small m, men rather than man, the right to say women can't vote, or don't have a right to reproductive freedom, or shouldn't be allowed to have jobs, and she took from Darwin's work the essential idea that equality comes from understanding that we are all coming from the design of nature. And here are some two quotes concerning her ideas about the moral law and the material world, and how we can, in human relations, be fair to each other when we treat each other as equals. Here's another one which she actually published very close, right before almost her death, where she takes onto the idea that the Bible degrades women in many passages, and we should avoid it at all costs. Andrew Dixon White is a very important free thinker. During the Civil War, he actually went abroad and made sure that England and France did not assist the breakaway states during the American Civil War. He's the one of the founders of Cornell University, which during the timing of Cornell, a lot of other universities were being founded that were religious based, and he demanded that Cornell be a secular institution and remain so. So, people who eventually went there, like Carl Sagan and Neil deGrasse Tyson and all these people who sought out Cornell, owe their thanks for, in a sense, for Cornell to have this majesty of being this hub of brilliance, secular brilliance, because of men like A.D. White, who was a humanist and really fought for the idea of truth and humanity. He also wrote this incredible treatise on the conflicts between between religion and science, which sort of mirrored the work of Draper, who 50 years earlier published a similar set of volumes on the same subject. And here are some things that he wrote on the history of warfare of science and Christendom. In all opposition had been availing nothing. Darwin's work was secure, and that his great labors, even though he was attacked, that all of these attacks came to nothing because he led an honest, kindly, and tolerant life. Charles Bradlaugh, now we're skipping from American Freethought to British Freethought, was the publisher of the National Reformer, which was a humanist paper from Britain's National Secular Society. He and Annie Besant would go on to stand trial for republishing a pamphlet on female contraception. This man, Charles Bradlaugh, did not want to take his oath when he was going into Parliament on a Bible, and he was imprisoned for his ideas. The idea that people can be imprisoned for not wanting to put their hands on a Bible seemed very, very scary. And this person not only rejected the idea, but kept to his ideas and made sure that it was known to those who followed him that he would go to jail for his beliefs, and he did. So he was a very good guy. This is one of the things. He was not only a publisher of this newspaper, but of several other papers. And in Cockbill's Darwin's Aesthetic, this came out, and it's very important to read. Hopefully you'll be able to go back. For the lack of time, I don't want to go over all of these, but I'll leave them up on the screen for a moment or two while I talk. So you can see how in the 19th century and into the 20th century, these people who are quoting Darwin or understanding Darwin's importance are taking his ideas and moving them around for what would become the 19th and 20th century free thought, civil rights movement even. Here's another quote from the atheistic platform from Bradlaugh that again lauds Darwin for his work and respects Darwin very much. Here's another. And again, the idea of the theme that, Darwin took the heat that Wallace never had to feel because natural selection, when it was published, it was Darwin who was ridiculed almost violently. And you see it today in our world, that same idea of ridiculing Darwin's work. So the issues have not changed in the last 150 years. The names may have changed, but the idea of concepts like intelligent design, irreducible complexity, faith-based understanding, teaching, the idea of teaching creationism alongside with natural selection as being equals. You see this over and over again, not only in the 19th century, but through the 20th and even the 21st century. Annie Besant, again, who was an intellectual, used Darwin's work to propel the suffrage movement in the UK during her lifetime as well. Here are just some quotes. And then we go to the, if some of these people were apostles, then the next generation, people who lived well into the 20th century or part of the 20th century, like George Foote, who was an atheist and a humanist, would go on to write books lauding Darwin and was a protege of Bradlaugh, and the publisher of Bradlaugh's paper had deep admiration for Darwin, and compared Darwin's work as so fundamentally important as to match it up with Newton. Here are certain things that Foote wrote. Darwin's work is remarkable, it's profound, and it changes our position, and it changes the destiny of our understanding of where we are in the universe. Again, this idea of putting Darwin in with Huxley and Tyndale and Spencer, making it very clear that, blasphemy is a crime that hurts no one. I'll leave you this last quote on George Foote up here. So this was written in his book, Darwin on God. And then Chapman Cone, who lived through World War I, World War II, all the way up through the 1950s, was a British humanist and social thinker. Some of you may know. He was very much really impressive in his own right, but someone who really did see Darwin's work as being seminal to the humanist and non-belief and the secular movement. And here are just some quotes. So now we get to the part of the presentation where I say, and if anyone is either going for a PhD or is thinking about a PhD, what will always come back to you when you're writing your thesis is, why does this matter? You know, why should we hold Darwin in such esteem? Why is Wallace's work on equal footing with Darwin, and why should we hold him in equal esteem for the work that was done in order to heighten our ideas of humanity's place in nature? Well, there are a couple of reasons. In the United States, the number of people who accept the idea that the world is natural is not as great as it should be when you compare other nations. You find almost consistently that certainly a core 1/3, but another third might have doubts, and another third in the United States will not accept natural selection, i.e. reality, for the sake of their beliefs in the spirit world or religion or some other reason. And you see, you know, one of the things that, you know, we always talk about the United States as being number one in many things, but in reality, you know, when education is dismantled and demoralized, it comes out in ways that makes us less competitive economically and as well as intellectually. And that certainly has an impact on the understanding of natural selection and science in general. These are somewhat older scores of the PISA average, but you see the United States is somewhere around, you know, 34th in mathematics, you know, 28th in reading, you know, 29th in science. And when you look at that, you can see that what danger that prevails in a nation that is founded on secular constitutional democracy, when we are ignorant of science, when we are ignorant of mathematics, when we are ignorant in terms of our reading skills, that can only have outcomes that are negative. And frankly, we saw those things happen, you know, in the Capitol just a few years ago. I'm sorry, a few. I wish it was a few years ago. Just a few weeks ago. You know, I'm surely believe of the mindset. Although I have not taken any census of the people who stormed the Capitol, but my idea is that probably not many, if any, had PhDs, and probably not many were scientists. And then we come to the people who are ruefully and interested to be remaining ignorant. You can go to Kentucky to the Creation Museum, where just as we were talking about, you know, in the 16th century, where you're finally getting to the idea that the world is not just 70,000 years old. Well, you can go to the Creation Museum in Kentucky and see that the lie of is still alive, that there are displays in this quote unquote museum where dinosaurs are with humans. Clearly that is based on philosophy and not science. And they built an ark park to boost the idea of the world being 6,000 years old, where nothing transitions. You know, it's very, very dangerous. You know, I always say this to my students when I'm teaching, that what this really sort of teaches is the idea of Flintstone science. That this has more akin to Hanna-Barbera with the Flintstones than it does as entertainment than it does as reality. And this is always, of course, my favorite. This isn't Gary Lawson, but it should have been, oh crap, was that today? Hopefully you're chuckling at that. And today we have real dangers to the idea that the natural order of the world, which is based on the material science, including Darwin's work in biology, but chemistry, physics, astronomy, so on and so forth, is under attack. People like to say the war on Christmas. Well, you're seeing this alt-right war on science, and now an alt-right attack on voting rights, where you have our former president, Mike Pence, who, when he was in Congress, got on, this is in the congressional record, spoke up and said that the world is 6,000 years old and God created it all and evolution isn't true, and Darwin's work is, well, he didn't actually mention Darwin, but the innuendo is that there's a creationist mindset, there's a creationist reality, and that's what I accept. It was former Senator Rick Santorum who tried to put into the No Child Left Behind Act when George Bush was president, an amendment to the law that said that all states and all counties were free to teach as equal to biology in the classroom the idea of creationism. And thank goodness that did not make it into the final bill's passing, but he put it in there. And then, of course, you have former members of the Trump team who I would think would not set foot or would be thought of as being humanists under any consideration or concern. So in summary, I'd like to add the following. The importance of Darwin's work really tells us that ideas can change the world. Bring that forward in your own studies. Bring that forward in your own work. Bring that forward, even if you're in the minority, because you can change the world by understanding the material universe. In fact, it's almost a responsibility of all of us to want to do so. That all of us are connected to one big story in our one human family. Darwin's work proved that. Anything that is external to us, our phenotype versus our genotype, is just the accumulation of traits from our ancestors. The whole idea of race theory and phrenology and all these things are nothing but magical thinking. And as we talked about earlier, natural selection has, because it was eventually considered so fundamental and profound to not only biology, but to all sciences, have changed the world and changed science in 1,000 different directions. So you should be that change as well. And I guess finally, we should be enlivened by this self-awareness. If it's one thing that humanism teaches us, is that if we are part of material nature, and that if we see ourselves as part of nature and not above nature, that not only can we build something together, all 8 billion of us, but then think of the imagination that we could take if we move away from fear and tribalism and the other and seek to explore our world and ourselves and then other worlds. That's a very Darwin point of view. That's a very scientific and humanistic point of view. So I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. I thank you for your time and attention. And if I've gone on too long, please accept my apologies.
It's been great. I appreciate it. We've got a few questions that have already come through, and so I'll ask those. But I just wanted to start out, and the New York Times a few days ago published sort of an article entitled "Darwin's Dim View of the Second Sex," and
Yes.
talking about women. And I saw your response on social media, so I would love it if you could just start out by just sort of answering, sort of giving your thoughts on that.
Sure. So as I mentioned in the presentation, Darwin believed and wrote that women needed to be taken care of, that women might not be or are not necessarily as smart as men. I think he came to it from the idea of, well, if we're going to keep our species going, then it depends on women being the caretakers. It was a very hunter-gatherer point of view, a very a sexist point of view. And I think Darwin was certainly on the wrong side of history with that. Darwin was anti-slavery, but he was not very fair in his thinking. Putting him into context of the 19th century, well, you know, there were people who were Darwin's apostles who were already supporting the movement for women's rights and equal rights. Darwin was just not really part of that. And we can't, you know, deny this. Darwin doesn't have to be, Darwin should not be put on a pedestal. His ideas should be respected. His time should be respected. And I do admire him for his work. I've been to Down House. I've spoken to relatives of Darwin, not through seances or anything like that, but 21st century living people, descendants of Darwin, descendants of Wallace, descendants of Hooker. You know, I can tell you that, you know, as complex as we think our lives are now, our in the 19th century lives were equally complex. But yeah, Darwin didn't get that right.
I appreciate that. So one of the questions we have is, can you comment, is from Mark, can you comment on religious and agnostic scientists, i.e. Ken Miller, Francis Collins, Michael Ruse, who use the term neo-Darwinism as an attempt to negatively label atheist scientists like Dawkins and Dennett, who dismiss the validity of theological evolution?
Sure. I mean, you know, it was... for those people who study science and who are scientists and who are also believers, I take nothing away from anybody who can keep those two magisteria, as Stephen Jay Gould would talk about them, in their heads as equal proportions. For me personally, you know, I am definitely in the camp of Dawkins and Dennett, because I see the need for religious faith as superfluous to the needs of a common humanity. While you know, people who like Francis Collins, who's a believer and head of the National Science Foundation and has all these responsibilities, can keep that bifurcation in their heads. I'm not one to be bifurcated in this way. And I don't think I'm closed-minded. And I don't think, I think neo-Darwinism is an unfair term, because it's not closed-minded to see the world without needing magic to lead a good, happy, just life. And those people who are non-believers, who are also scientists, you know, accept the world as it is. And I think that's really, really important, because if not us, who? And the reality is that Darwin was criticized as well by the religious and by people who would not accept his theory. And he lived with it. So, you know, in my mind, there's no real great debate here. Just like there's no real great debate that creationism is equal to, or intelligent design is equal to our understanding of modern biology. The fossil evidence and the genetic evidence not only shows our ancestry, but explains and explores the world much more elegantly and infinitely than the belief in a particular Judeo-Christian God or some form of spirituality, which none of those things make the idea of natural selection better. There's no talk about God in these works, nor should there be, because we live in a material universe that doesn't require them. So I hope that helps.
Sure. No, thank you. Charles asks, he says, you mentioned Darwin's work inspiring and changing other fields of thought, such as art and education, but you also said that his works were only meant to concern biology. So do you consider that his inspiring changes in other fields were misinterpretations or abuses of his work, or are some of them legitimate?
Well, I think that art is always in the mind of the beholder, where what I meant to say, and I apologize if I confused anyone, that Darwin's work should not be misinterpreted as having meaning as to social Darwinism. That is, the idea that somehow societies act as biological organisms. They do not. And so the idea of social Darwinism, which is the idea that, quote unquote, survival of the fittest, means that if you're the best, most aggressive society, you're going to win and you should all bow down and stuff like that. And then they say, well, that's Darwin's way of thinking. Darwin never wrote about society. He was not a sociologist. He was essentially a biologist. Now, for things like the material sciences, cosmology, pharmacology, you can't get away from the ideas of extinction and speciation and adaptation, which are all part of Darwin's work. So that's really important. As for how people may practice their understanding of Darwin versus what Darwin meant are different things. But if people are excited and inspired by Darwin's work in, let's say, the arts or literature, which there's a whole literature of people who are inspired by Darwin's work. Gene Roddenberry, of Star Trek fame, was inspired by Darwin's work. And so many other people that, when it comes to art, that reflection is really a reflection of the artist and his or her times.
Great. I have a question from Levi. He starts out, he says, I abandoned Christianity after accepting the evidence and evolution and recognizing its incompatibility with science. Mm-hmm. So do you have any thoughts on what it will take Islam to move in this direction? Or are we seeing a movement within the faith towards science?
Oh, that's a great question. Up until about 1,000 years ago, when Europe was in its dark ages, Islamic thinkers and Islamic mathematicians kept math and science alive. So there's always been this movement, I will not call it biologic, but I'll call it organic, between societies and cultures. If you look at the data, right? So rather than give my opinion, I'll give you my idea of the data. If you look at what's happening with people who are much younger than I am, the rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S versus N-U-N-S. You see that there's this incredible movement away from religious thinking. May not necessarily be spiritual thinking, I can be inspired and look at the stars and feel a spiritual connection to the universe. That doesn't mean it's a religious connection. So people have moved away from religion, organized religion, pretty quickly. Most churches, synagogues, even some mosques are empty on holy days during the week, and only see participation during spikes during particular times, whether it be, Easter or Rosh Hashanah or, Eid or something like that. Certainly in secular societies, like in the United States, where you have that freedom to believe what you wish or accept what you wish via conclusion, that certainly secular democracy is the antidote to religious-based thinking, as much as science. In fact, they go together. You can't have healthy science without having healthy secular democracy. So I think in the Islamic world that those nations that become more secular will become less religious. Now you look at Turkey, which for many years was a very secular country and has turned to become more Islamist. But then you look at other countries and you see that might be less so. Certainly, if you come to America, even though the religion of your parents and the rituals of your parents, they may be ascribed to you, you might lead a different life. In fact, I know many people in many different faith communities, Islam included, who, when the doors are closed, understand that it's not real and go along with it because they can't break out of their family's tradition. So, what we can do as secularists, as humanists, as people who accept secular democracy, is be welcoming to people. The more you are open to the experience of shedding biases and accepting people from different cultures, the stronger the bonds of our common humanity grow. And that helps people leave religion behind, because if you lead by example, you lead in 1,000 different directions. You launch 1,000 ships of goodness by doing that. I hope that helps.
And Dana asks, do you feel that scientists who have embraced religion have compromised their research, even if unwittingly?
It depends. Like I said, I'm not one to accept a theological viewpoint of the world. For those people who are religious and are doing science, it's hard not to worry about the corruption that may be caused. But if you live an evidence-based life and you look at the research, and if the research holds up, then I guess you can just not have to have that fear, but always be cognizant that, just like all research, right, whether it's religious based or not, if there are scientists who fudge their numbers, not based on a religious view, but because they want to get tenure, I've seen that happen more than people dealing with religion. You got to worry more about that. Or people who want to make a name for themselves and they publish too early, or they mess with their data. That I think is more of a problem. But that doesn't mean that we can't also include in that the idea that if someone is so religious that, if they use their religion to alter their data, then they're no longer doing science, and they should not be respected for doing so.
Great. If you're okay, we have one little more serious question than one softball.
Okay.
Sure. So Amy asked, and this is, I think, going back to a little bit what I sort of started the question and answer with. Do you think that Darwin's disregard of women might have impaired him in that women and men are different, as in brain function. Could this scientific thinking be the reason, scientific in quotes, be the reason that women have not historically been involved in clinical testing?
Wow, I mean that's that's a pretty deep question. You know, I don't think we can blame Darwin for all of patriarchy's ills. Certainly, he did not contribute to the modern world in which, in that case, as he should have. Maybe as I believe he should have. But you know, it's such a complex issue. You know, one of the things that I find, and this was the case in academia outside of Darwin, is that, you know, for generations, it's been an old boys club. It's been white guys from Europe running the show. And that's really been something that we have to not only be aware of and understand the dangers of that, but also give credit to the people who I said earlier on in the first slide, who have made such significant contributions to science, to social science, to our lives. When they don't look like me, you know, or they're a different gender, whatever they feel their gender is, that I dream of a world where that need to classify someone as tribally the other and ascribe to them faults, which are just nothing more than biases, becomes part of our history, that it winds up in a museum one day where 100 years from now or 50 years from now, children will go back and look and say, we really thought that, because it's going to be as earth-shattering to an idea as the idea that women shouldn't have a right to their reproductive freedom, which we're still fighting now in this country and in other countries, that equality does not belong to each and every one of us. So, you know, I am a humanist. I'm an optimist. I'm rational in my optimism, though. But I'm also an activist, formerly working at the United Nations for human rights and women's rights and the right for non-believers to speak and think freely. So all those things are deeply important to me. And I may not have fully answered your question, but I do think that Darwin was part of the problem in that sense, not part of the solution.
I really sort of appreciate how you've sort of taken most of your answers and really the point of your whole presentation and looking at, so starting with Darwin and evolution and bringing it really to that humanistic free thought value. So you've continued, I really love how you've continued to do that. And I'm not saying you're doing it intentionally, but how you've done that with all of your answers. So that's great. So here's your softball. So Levi asks, he says, what's the best book on secularism that you have read most recently?
Whew. Okay. On secularism. Well, that's a really good question. I'd have to look around my office because I've got a lot of old books and new books here. And I have a lot in other places too. I mean, I think that there's a lot that has been written, and I would think, well, hold on, let me get up. Let me see if I can find them. Well, you know, there are so many that are that you can come from this issue of secularism from a million different views. From Rob Boston, I think, wrote an excellent book about the law and secularism and humanism. This is by Philip Kitcher. This is called Life After Faith, The Case for Secular Humanism. So it's a personal book, but it's also a very good book. So I don't know this person, but I've liked the book. So I would recommend that to you. I'm working on a new book now called The Accidental Species, which focuses, and that title may change. You see a couple of hominids right back there. But I'm writing a new book, and it's about human empathy and human violence. And I've got several people writing portions of it. I'm editing the book, and it covers everything from law and justice, education, art, the history of violence, and even like a humanity 2.0. So there's a lot going on. So hopefully you'll like that book, because I think it has a lot of humanistic and secular value. And look for it in next year.
Great. Well, and I think it's interesting that we're sort of having this conversation sort of after 2020,
Right.
where, and especially right now, where on the news, I mean, newscasters and scientists and doctors and everyone sort of giving us a quick time live view of evolution with the coronavirus, and the variants and the mutations, and it's almost science class every day on television.
The moment someone mentions variant, you go back to Darwin, speciation, adaptation, extinction. There you go.
Exactly.
Yep.
So I really appreciate your time today. One, I think you give up so much of your time and dedication to not only with lectures and your knowledge, but also your time and your leadership within the secular communities. So thank you very much for that. And also thank you for, as a faculty member and working with students, clearly that's a passion of ours. And we know that our students really appreciate it. So thank you for that as well.
Well, it's my pleasure. And let me just add to the students out there and who may watch this in the future. You have a friend. Look me up on Facebook, send me an email. If I can help you in any way, I was very fortunate to have one or two professors who really helped me become the person who I am right now. And if you don't have that in your life right now, and you're looking for it, don't be afraid to ring me up or email me, because I'm happy to mentor at any time and at any moment.
Great. Thank you so much for everything today. Sure. You've given us a lot of good time. Thank you for hanging with us and answering those questions. I really appreciate it. Sure. Have a good night.
Good night. Bye-bye.